Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. So thank you very much for joining today's webinar on carbon footprinting. Your company's climate readiness starts here. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you will agree that the carbon footprint is a good place to start your company's climate journey. Just a few tips on or notes on housekeeping. If you can just please make sure that you are muted throughout the presentation, and you can leave your Q&A questions. You can leave your Q&A questions in the Q&A chat. We will address them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the recording after we wrap up. So without further ado, I will get started. So just to introduce myself first, my name is Anna Jeżewska. I'm a manager at CEST based in Poland. And I have been working in sustainability for around 5 years now, supporting private sector companies across Europe with their organizational carbon footprinting, decarbonization strategies, and ESG reporting. I have experience with a wide range of companies, both in the service and manufacturing sector, and I hope to kind of bring some of those insights from my experience into the presentation today. So today's agenda, what we will be covering. First, I will tell you a little bit about Cevida, who we are as a company. Then I will give sort of an introduction to carbon footprinting. I had quite some trouble naming this section because it's not just kind of a basic introduction. We'll also kind of look at carbon footprints in different sectors, as well as results from some of the projects that we've done. But you'll see that when we come to that section. And then the third section will be going beyond the footprint, so talking about some other climate-related analyses that are either directly related to the footprint or complement one another. And then lastly, we will be talking about the drivers of climate action and the business benefits of climate action. So to start with the first section on who we are, Cevida is an advisory and digital services firm. We were started in the Baltics, and now we are spread across 21 countries. We operate in kind of 3 streams: the private, public, and innovation and funding stream. So within private, we provide services such as strategic planning, M&A support, brand analysis, and consumer insights. For public sector clients, we provide public policy, economic development, and cities and infrastructure development advice. And then the innovation and funding side of the business focuses on developing ecosystems, acceleration programs, and helping companies apply for innovation funding, both at the EU and national level, for the innovations they're trying to develop within their companies. Then on the digital side of the business, we do things such as web and mobile app development, software development, digital transformation, as well as provide other design and creative services. So within Cevida as a whole, we provide really kind of the full suite of services that any company might need. And the sustainability team specifically sits within our private sector advisory practice. We bring that technical expertise on ESG topics, and because we sit within this private sector advisory consultancy, we're always trying to connect the ESG topics with the real understanding of the economic reality for businesses, because we understand that's the only way to drive real change in the economy. Going into a little bit about what our sustainability services are specifically. First, we have environmental analysis as our kind of core first pillar. There we provide carbon footprint assessments, life cycle assessments for products, as well as avoided carbon impact assessments. So a lot of this is quite technical work, and it's a lot of times where companies will start their sustainability journey, not having done anything else. The carbon footprint is usually the first step for them. Then this kind of second pillar of services that we have is ESG strategy and ESG analytics and strategy. So we do things like double materiality assessments that were required under CSRD. So that's understanding what is the company's impact on environment and society, and what are the financial implications of changes in the environment and society on the business. And we will use the environmental analysis that we do and other kind of analytics to develop ESG strategies and policies for businesses. That also includes diversity and equality audits. Specifically, we have specialists within our team who are able to do that. And then lastly, there is kind of this third section, which a lot of times wraps up what a lot of the other work is about. So compliance and reporting. Of course, we have certain regulatory requirements, such as SFDR, CSRD, the EU taxonomy. We support clients with making sure that they are compliant against those regulations. But we also support clients with sustainability reporting that is not mandated by regulation. So according to standards such as the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. And the last point on environmental product declarations is linked to the life cycle assessment in the first tier of services. And that's the way that companies can communicate the environmental credentials of their products. So it's again kind of wrapping it up into something that is publicly accessible in order to share with customers, business partners, and investors. And by providing all of those services, we've worked with a very wide variety of companies across different sectors. And especially popular, as I mentioned before, are these carbon footprinting projects. So we're excited to share some of those insights that we've gained across the years with you today. So on to our first section, the introduction to carbon footprinting. Before we jump into the technical aspects, I do want to do just a bit of scene setting, since we always have a mix of different people on these webinars, just so we all understand why we're talking about carbon footprints at all. So the release of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere is causing global warming, which through extreme weather events, rising sea levels, biodiversity loss, etc., is causing and will cause widespread social and economic disruptions if we don't take action to change the course. So on the screen, we have some visual projections of what reality could look like in 2050 in some very popular holiday destinations if we don't act faster to reduce emissions. We see more and more reports, news articles about the impacts of climate change, and we are starting to feel those impacts more and more locally where we live, but also in business. So this sense of urgency is building. And where are we in our efforts to mitigate climate change? So in the chart, you can see global historical greenhouse gas emissions and different pathways to 2100 based on different scenarios of pledges and policies, which will result in varying levels of warming. And we can see that there's a very big gap between the emissions released on a 1.5C compatible pathway versus the pathway that we're on based on current policies and actions that have been implemented. So this is quite stark when you see something like this in front of you. There's this urgent need to act. There's this huge gap. On the plus side, though, it is within our power to make the changes that are needed. Reducing our greenhouse gas emissions first requires us to understand where our impact comes from so we can manage it. And that brings us to the topic of organizational carbon footprinting. So to start with the basics, carbon footprinting for organizations is organized into 3 scopes. Scope 3 is the most complex. It has the most categories, but it is also the most critical to assess. And hopefully, as the presentation goes on, you'll understand why. So at the very most basic level, just to define this for everyone, greenhouse gases are released through either the combustion of fossil fuels or direct release of gases that cause global warming in the atmosphere. So there are 7 types of greenhouse gases that are considered in this organizational accounting. The ones that are the most familiar to most people would be carbon dioxide and methane. The rest of them are a little bit less known in general. So sulfur hexafluoride, for example, is a gas that it doesn't have to be burned, it doesn't have to combust when it's released into the atmosphere. It has its own global warming potential, and it is actually the gas with the highest global warming potential out of all of the gases. And it's used as an insulating gas in electricity transmission systems. So that's a very specific gas, but for other ones like carbon dioxide and methane, those are very common when we combust fossil fuels. And so those are ones that people are usually more familiar with. So in terms of how the scopes are divided, scope 1 is defined as the direct greenhouse gas emissions from sources under the company's ownership or control. What this really means is from stationary sources such as buildings or mobile sources such as vehicles, the combustion of fossil fuels, as well as a few other sources of emissions, which I'll go into on the next slide. Then scope 2 is the indirect greenhouse gas emissions, indirect because it's what the company is purchasing from another company. So this is purchased electricity, heat, steam, or cooling. And then scope 3 is much more. So there are 15 categories of scope 3, and they are broken down to identify different parts of the value chain. And it's done this way so companies kind of have a framework to work with, and they can identify different emission sources from different parts of the value chain. So very briefly, if we look at the upstream part of the value chain, we know how companies work essentially. So we know that companies purchase different goods and services. They use logistics services, they generate waste, their employees commute to work, they do business travel. And so all of those things are within those upstream scope 3 categories. Very similarly, in downstream scope 3, here we're looking at logistics that is paid for by their business partners, not for the business themselves, not by the business themselves, the further processing of intermediate products. So if a company is producing a product that is then used to kind of used in the final assembly of a final product, there's further processing and therefore further emissions that are released. The use of a product. So if we think about a simple mobile phone, of course, there's emissions from the production of that product, but then there's also emissions throughout the entire life of the product because we are constantly charging our phones using electricity. So all of these stages in upstream and downstream scope 3 generate emissions. And the purpose of the footprint is to analyze where the emissions are coming from and how big they are for a particular business. So I will not go through each scope 3 category in detail today in terms of methodology or exactly what's included, because that would take up an entire webinar. But on the next slide, I will try to give you a sense of the actual activities behind the emissions in each scope so you can start to understand it a little bit better. So moving on to that. In scope 1, I mentioned that combustion of fuels is one of the kind of largest sources of emissions. But then you also have emissions from physical or chemical processing. Again, if these gases are kind of used in those processes and released directly into the atmosphere, or emissions from unintentional leaks. A lot of times this is from refrigeration and air conditioning equipment that uses refrigerants that have a global warming potential. These refrigerants will unintentionally leak from the equipment, and we need to account for that within the scope 1 emissions. So those are all of your sources for scope 1. Then scope 2 is fairly straightforward because it's one bullet point. So again, purchased electricity, heat, steam, and cooling. But what I want to touch on here is that there are two different accounting approaches for scope 2, which you might see in a company sustainability report. They are called the location-based approach and the market-based approach. So what the location-based approach basically does is say, I'm a company that is in Poland. That's where I'm based. So that's where we'll take the example. I'm based in Poland. And if I want to calculate my emissions from the electricity that I use, in the location-based approach, I'm going to use a average grid mix factor. So for all of the different types of electricity sources that are going into the grid, some of it might be, as we have here, wind, some of it might be coal, basically the average grid mix, I'm going to use an emission factor that reflects that average grid mix and apply it to my electricity consumption in order to get my emissions. On the other hand, the market-based approach says that if I'm procuring, let's say, green energy through a specific contract, like a renewable energy certificate or a power purchase agreement, I can actually reflect that in the emissions inventory. And for the amount of electricity that I procure through those contractual instruments, they get a zero emission factor, so they don't have any emissions associated with them. And the other portion that I don't have, the other portion of my electricity consumption that I don't have covered by these instruments, I will use what's called the residual mix factor. So the residual mix factor is essentially, if you imagine all of the different energy sources within an electricity grid, some are dirty, some are clean, etc. The residual mix is essentially everything that's left after you take out everything that's tracked. So if we imagine that what's most commonly tracked is the renewables, if you take all of those tracked renewables out, you're left with a more carbon intensive grid. That is the residual mix. So it's a little bit technical, but what's the point here? The reason that we have these two approaches is because we do have these instruments available on the market that companies can actually choose to pay, let's say, more to have a renewable energy contract, to pay for renewable energy certificates, and then they can show that, they can reflect it in their Scope 2 accounting. So if you choose the market-based approach, that essentially allows you to reflect your climate action by procuring renewables in your greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Then the last part that we'll talk about here is Scope 3. As I mentioned, I will not be going through all of the different categories because it would be its own webinar, but I wanted to give you some examples of some of the business activities that are behind emissions in each of these Scope 3 categories. So for purchase goods and services and capital goods, what we actually want to capture in the emissions inventory for these categories is the manufacturing emissions of products that we're purchasing, or if we call them capital goods in our financial accounting, but it's essentially the same thing. If it's equipment and you capitalize it, it's a capital good, but if it's, I don't know, your IT equipment and you don't capitalize that, it goes into purchase goods and services. But essentially what this represents is, again, the manufacturing emissions of those products, so the product footprint, as well as services. So for services, it's a little bit kind of less clear, but the idea is the same, that all of the services that you're procuring from other companies, they have an emissions intensity associated with them. So we want to account for all of the purchased goods and services that the company is using in the given year, and that is reflected in the emissions inventory. Another category is transportation and distribution. So here, the types of, this is basically transportation and distribution provided by logistics providers. So you're paying a third party to transport the raw materials that you purchase. What we need in terms of actual data in order to calculate the emissions on this is the fuel used or the ton kilometers that were traveled, and the mode of transport, whether it's by sea, by plane, by truck, etc. For business travel, we are typically collecting data on the distance traveled, again, by the mode of transport. Is it a taxi? Is it an airplane? And also, if it's a really big part of the business model to have business travel, and that requires a lot of hotel stays, then we would also want to include the hotel stays because it'll form a significant part of the inventory. So we'll need to know how many nights were stayed, what geographies were they in. Then use of sold products. So here, if we think about a physical products, let's go back to kind of the mobile phone. We're looking to capture the energy use over the entire estimated lifespan of the product. So for that, we need to estimate what that lifespan will be. Let's say for a mobile phone, it would be 7 years. I'm making this up just hypothetically. and then also where that product is used, because obviously around the world, there are different grid emission factors for electricity, and we need to then put those things together in order to estimate the emissions for this specific category. Then lastly, we have end-of-life treatment of sold products. So here it would be things like, what is the product composition? What geography is it in? So then we can start to think about what are the waste treatment practices within those specific geographies, figure out what the waste treatment type is. Do they take these products apart? Are they recycled as a whole, etc., in order to calculate the emissions from the end of life of that sold product. Even though the end of life is not in the same year that you sell it, this is just for accounting purposes. We're accounting for the things that we sell in that year when we do the emissions inventory for this year, for example. So now that you kind of have hopefully a conceptual understanding of the activities that are behind some of these emissions categories, what I wanted to do is look at the emissions hotspots in different sectors so you can see how they vary. Here we have some data from the CDP, that's formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. They're a global nonprofit that runs the world's leading environmental disclosure system for companies, cities, states, and regions. They essentially provide a standardized platform where organizations can voluntarily disclose their information on both emissions, but also other environmental topics. And then this information is scored and shared with investors, customers, and other stakeholders. So the CDP data provides a view of typical emissions hotspots in each sector. This data is a few years old. They did this kind of technical analysis, I think, in 2021. But the purpose of doing this analysis was to guide companies in the areas where they should focus their mitigation actions. They kind of wanted to provide these averages because they get so much data. They're able to have kind of a significant sample in order to develop this type of analysis and show in this particular sector, this is typically where you can see the largest emissions hotspots. So here, what's the first thing that jumps out is probably that scope 3, which is in black, is a very large percentage of total emissions across most sectors. And this really shows that imperative to engage in value chain decarbonization. It's not just about your scope 1 and 2 emissions, but a lot of your emissions will relate to your business relationships in either the upstream or downstream value chain. So on the next slide, I wanted to go through two sectors from the CDP data, just to show you a little bit of that contrast and how these scope 3 categories vary by sector. So the charts that we have are the greenhouse gas emissions categories as a percentage of total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for that sector. The agricultural commodities sector is made up of companies that are doing crop farming, fish and animal farming. And for them, purchased goods and services is the most significant category in all of their scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint. What does this represent? That is the upstream emissions from the feed that they're purchasing for animals. If we think about a pig farm, for example, a lot of both the expenditure, but then also the emissions are coming from actually the feed that needs to be produced in order to feed the animals. And then when we think about farming, it's actually purchasing fertilizer. So the fertilizer production is actually a very emissions intensive process. So that's why we see purchased goods and services making up such a large share in the agricultural commodities sector. The next category down at 8% is processing of sold products. And this is because those commodities, they need to be further processed, they need to be packaged, they need to be stored. Scope 1 is the fuel consumption that those companies are actually using in their own operations, and then use of sold products is actually reflecting the cooking energy use during the cooking of these foods. And then in contrast, we have the real estate sector, which is made up primarily of building developers and owners. So there's kind of a mix here in terms of different business models within the same real estate sector. But capital goods, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is about embodied emissions. So for the real estate sector, it's the embodied emissions of new buildings, meaning what were the construction materials such as steel and concrete that came together in order to build this building. it makes sense that that is the largest category for the real estate sector here. Then downstream leased assets. So for building owners, these are the assets that are leased to other organizations, and the emissions here are reflective of the fuel and electricity use in those assets. Then purchased goods and services are things related to facilities management and contractors. Again, this is both goods and services. And then the rest are much smaller, as you can see. Something that I do want to note is that for building developers, which is not really kind of shown here distinctly, and this might be because of the specific sample that we have, but for building developers, upstream transportation to account for the material logistics, so I need to bring that steel and that concrete to my site, that may also be a significant contributor to scope 3, even though here we don't see it on the kind of aggregated level as being very important. It really depends on the specific business model of the business. One other thing to mention about the real estate sector is, as you see here, use of sold products is all the way at the bottom, 1%. This is likely to be underestimated here due to the lack of reported data. So again, because these are data sets from companies a few years ago, they are reflecting data that was actually reported. It wasn't kind of no extra data was added. And so here we have to always look at these with a grain of, take it with a grain of salt and think about, this sort of doesn't make sense here. I kind of would expect use of sold products to be larger in this category because of the sector. Because when we're talking about a building, in the year that the developer sells the building, they should account for the lifetime operational emissions of that building. So you can imagine that might be a lot larger than 1%. So maybe ending here on this slide, I want to just bring your attention to how the carbon footprint really provides this mapping of carbon intensity of different parts in a company's value chain. And if we move to the next slide, that is why we see the company carbon footprint as a compass for climate action. And we wanted to bring some real world examples from our project experience, so you can understand what we mean by taking the results of the footprint and actually turning it into climate action. So the first example is of a unified communications solution provider. So this is a B2B business that is providing kind of phones, headsets, and also software for unified communications within the business. And the carbon footprint revealed that the embodied emissions, so again, those manufacturing emissions of the phones and the headsets, and then the use of those sold products throughout their lifetime, those two things formed a very significant share of their total emissions within scope 1, 2, and 3. So what action did they take? They began engaging their contract manufacturer, because they didn't actually manufacture these products themselves, to understand the potential of energy efficiency and eco-design improvements. So here we have an example of supplier engagement in order to reduce scope 3 emissions that are outside of the company's direct control. The second example is for a cybersecurity solutions provider that we worked with. They actually came to us with a carbon footprint from the previous year that showed that their marketing services were a major emissions source for their business, even though they are using a lot of data centers. They have their own servers, and then they also have use of third-party data centers, etc. Marketing, because of how much money they spend on marketing, was showing up as a really, really big emissions hotspot, because they were using a spend-based approach. They were estimating emissions not based on specific activity data or supplier-specific data, but just based on the amount of money that they were spending on it, because those emission factors do exist. So what we decided to do with them was actually go to their suppliers, the marketing agencies, the influencers, and collect primary data on their activities. What are they actually doing when they're providing these services, in order to shift from a spend-based approach to an activity-based approach? The result of this was a much lower carbon footprint. And so here we have an example of supplier engagement, not necessarily to reduce the scope 3 emissions, but to actually improve the footprint accuracy. So then next year, I know where I should actually be focusing. That marketing is not where the majority of my emissions lie. And I can look at my future efforts through a different lens. And then lastly, we have an example of a heat pumps reseller that we worked with. So as you might imagine, selling a heat pump, the company found that a significant portion of its emissions came from the end user using those heat pumps throughout their lifetime. So what action did they take? They decided to develop an ESG strategy that is focused on transitioning their product portfolio towards heat pumps that are highly energy efficient, but also heat pumps that have a low global warming potential refrigerant. So because the use of sold products for heat pumps, the emissions are coming both from the electricity consumption, but also from the assumed leakage that is coming from these refrigerants, which have a global warming potential. So those gases are released, and immediately we have kind of a global warming impact. So this particular client, their ESG strategy, based on the hard data, based on the footprint that we calculated, really shows their commitment to business transformation and allowed them to create a strategy that is aligned with the numbers. So that's our first section on carbon footprinting. Apologies for flying through it, but we have a lot of content to get through, so I'm keen to keep moving. So now in this section, we will be going beyond the footprint, and we'll be talking about other climate-related assessments and topics, some of which are kind of directly related to the carbon footprint, and some of which are a bit more tangential or complementary. So the first one that we want to talk about is science-based targets. Science-based targets will show businesses how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to prevent the worst effects of climate change. When we talk about science-based targets, we have based this on the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a corporate climate action organization, which develops standards, tools, and guidance that allow companies to set greenhouse gas emissions targets in line with reaching net zero by 2050 at the latest. So here on the left-hand side, we have a very simple explanation of what a science-based target is. As I mentioned, these are targets that are going to be based on climate science. So the SBTI has essentially kind of done the dirty work for companies and provided tools that they're able to kind of quite easily model how they need to reduce their emissions in order to be aligned to the climate science. So this is, again, based on a company's unique greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So you need to have a high quality and complete greenhouse gas emissions inventory in order to set a science-based target. And companies can set near-term targets, which are between 5 and 10 years, or a net zero target for the long term, which has to be achieved by 2050 at the latest. If you want to set a net zero target, it is actually a requirement also to set a near-term target as well. So you can't just set the long-term target. Now we'll talk very briefly about target requirements and methods, because I don't want to go too much into the nitty-gritty details. But essentially, for near-term and long-term targets, there are kind of different boundaries and ambitions for scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3. So the near-term requirements for scope 1 and 2, the boundary means how much of your emissions inventory has to be included in the target. So for scope 1 and 2, it's minimum 95%. For scope 3, it's 67% for the near-term target. The scope 3 target, the scope 3 near-term target is required if scope 3 is over 40% of total emissions, which, as we saw from the CDP data, it is very likely for companies in many sectors that their scope 3 emissions will be over 40% of their total emissions. And so in that case, you can't just set a scope 1 and 2 near-term target, you also have to set a scope 3 near-term target. And in terms of the ambition for near-term targets, for scope 1 and 2, ambition is 1.5 degrees Celsius. For scope 3, it has to be well below 2. Can be 1.5, but well below 2, which is a little bit of a less ambitious target, is also allowed for the near-term target. And then kind of similarly for long-term targets, For scope 1 and 2, it's a 95% emissions boundary. You have to cover 95% of emissions. For scope 3, it's 90%, and these are both aligned to a 1.5C ambition. So those are the target requirements. And very briefly to talk about the different methods, because again, there are different methods that companies can choose in order to essentially define their emissions reduction pathway. One of these is an absolute reduction method that is kind of applicable for all sectors. There's a percentage annual reduction that is at a minimum consistent with the pathway based on IPCC carbon budget scenarios. Then there is a sector-specific intensity convergence method. This is for homogeneous sectors. So there will be different percentage reductions for different sectors based on sectoral carbon budgets, but again, only for kind of homogeneous sectors. The SBTI has built sector-specific approaches for 11 high-impact sectors, such as aviation, buildings, and others. Some of the sectors actually have to use the sector-specific method, and others are able to choose a different one. Then we also have methods called the physical intensity reduction. So this is the emissions, let's say, per kilogram of product produced that can be used as a kind of as a method for emissions reduction, or economic intensity, very similarly, emissions per euro revenue. And lastly, supplier engagement targets. This method is actually about getting suppliers to set their own science-based targets, and is only eligible for the near-term targets, not for long-term. Then we just wanted to briefly go over kind of key decarbonization levers. How should companies actually achieve their science-based target? And the reason we wanted to do this is obviously these are, of course, very high level. I think most people will know about these in theory. But the reason for putting this here is really to kind of put number 6 at the bottom, the neutralization of residual emissions. So some companies think that I will set a science-based target, I will simply purchase a lot of offsets and then achieve my target. This is not how this works. We need real decarbonization through electrification, transition to renewable energies, energy efficiency improvements, the engagement of the value chain, whether that's having your suppliers set their own targets, introducing low carbon procurement standards within your organization, more I would say complex changes such as product and business model innovation as well. You have to go through all of these different decarbonization levers, and then the neutralization of residual emissions, which have to be less than 10%, through permanent carbon removals, such as afforestation or the carbon capture and storage solutions, which are kind of supposedly under development. We just wanted to make the point that the neutralization of residual emissions really comes last. You shouldn't be thinking about offsets. If you want to set a science-based target, you need to be thinking about what your real decarbonization levers are, how to actually achieve that target. So that's science-based targets in a nutshell and very quickly. The next topic that we wanted to talk about is climate risk and opportunity assessments. So according to the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report for this year, 2025, climate risk is really only expected to increase. It predicts that by 2035, 4 out of the 5 biggest risks to our global economy will be related to a rapidly changing climate. So those top risks, just to contextualize for you, are extreme weather events, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, critical changes to Earth systems, and natural resource shortages. So naturally, these risks are expected to impact business financials, but through what channels and to what extent for a particular business is an open question. So the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, created a framework in order to assess just that, how these risks and opportunities will affect businesses. So they put together specific categories in order to cover potential market and physical drivers that we have here. And I want to just briefly go through them so you can understand what is within each of these. So on the physical risks, we have acute risks, which are event-driven, so such as hurricanes, um, a flood, those types of events, versus chronic physical risks, which are these long-term shifts in climate patterns. So this could be chronic heat waves, rising sea levels, and those are how physical risks are divided. Then when we think about transition risks, we have policy and legal risks. So this could be something like carbon pricing. It could be the risk of being taken to court for your lack of climate action. Technology risks. So it's the new technologies that are coming onto the market related to renewables, battery storage, etc. Is that somehow going to pose a technology risk for your company? Then we have market risks. So these are shifts in supply and demand based on consumer preferences and based on kind of other market factors. And then also reputational risk. So do you have some sort of reputational risk for your lack of climate action? Those are the main categories for risks under TCFD. And then for opportunities, we have, again, how are we going to use the outcomes of the transition to a net zero economy in order to save money or to make money? So the first one, resource efficiency, is the financial savings from being more resource efficient, both in terms of energy and material efficiency. Energy sources, it's switching energy sources to a lower carbon energy source. Products and services is, again, the innovation here. It's the innovation of a low carbon product or service. Markets is the access to new markets through this innovation, and resilience is kind of the accumulation of those actions and how it's going to build a more resilient business. And so all of these things will have some sort of impact on the income statement, the cash flow statement, the balance sheet. And the risk and opportunity assessment is trying to uncover those financial impacts, both positive and negative, within these different types of categories. So we have, I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the key steps for the climate risk and opportunity assessment and about specifically the warming scenarios. So we say the first step for this assessment is to map your operations and your value chain. Because the climate risk and opportunity assessment is not just about your direct operations, it's also about what is happening in your value chain and how that will flow through the economy and impact you eventually. So the first step is mapping those operations and value chains so you have a very clear view of what your business relationships are. Then you go through an assessment of identifying those, the activity of identifying risks and opportunities by looking at these TCFD categories that we've just talked about. So under physical risk, transition risk, and transition opportunities, we kind of want to look through all of those categories and each value chain stage and consider, okay, in my suppliers, am I exposed to some kind of physical risk that's going to impact them, whether it's chronic or acute? And you go through and you assess these risks and opportunities, or try to identify these risks and opportunities by considering those external kind of market impacts and the different parts of your value chain. So then comes the part on scenario analysis. Once we have this, let's say, qualitative understanding of what we think our risks and opportunities will be, we want to use some scenarios in order to stress test those risks and opportunities that we've identified and to quantify them. So the scenario analysis is about really quantifying the risks and opportunities that are identified under plausible futures. So what we have here on the screen are some visuals of scenarios from the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System. And each NGFS scenario explores a different set of assumptions for how climate policies would evolve, how emissions would evolve, how temperatures would evolve, physical risk impacts, etc. Within each emission scenario, those things are different. And typically when companies are doing this, their scenario analysis will involve at least a business as usual scenario. So one that has higher warming, meaning if we look at the visual on the left, we have kind of current policies and nationally determined contributions. those are sort of business as usual scenarios where you see that the physical risks, because of what we're not doing, are going to be higher because we're going into higher warming territory. But the transition risks, we're not really transitioning quite well into a low carbon economy, so the transition risks will be lower. Whereas if we look at the other scenarios, it'll kind of be flipped. So in the net zero scenario, we are limiting those physical risks because we're actually moving to the 1.5 degree pathway quickly, but the transition risks will be higher because companies will have to adapt to changing policy, changes in market forces, etc. So in this part, scenario analysis is providing a variety of data, really, from different pathways. So there will be transition pathway variables, as you can see on the screen here, in that first circle, which will give us variables that we might be able to then use in our calculations in order to be able to quantify these risks and opportunities. So we have variables on transition pathways, on the physical risk, and also on macro financial implications. Maybe just to give an example, since I understand this is always a little bit difficult to understand in theory, is if in step 2, I identified that there is an opportunity to change my fuel source into a renewable energy source, then in the scenario analysis, I can try to quantify that by looking at 2 different scenarios. I'll look at the net zero scenario and one of the business as usual scenarios. In the net zero scenario, if I am using currently fossil fuels, then in the net zero scenario, we would expect that, and the macro financial kind of impacts variables will tell me that those fossil fuel prices will increase over time. And so in the net zero scenario, this fuel switching will provide me with a lot of cost savings. While under the current policy scenario, where we wouldn't expect the price of fossil fuels to be impacted because we're not transitioning to net zero, then that opportunity wouldn't really materialize, right? So the point of the scenario analysis is to understand the conditions that have to exist in order for a risk or opportunity to actually materialize, and to be able to quantify that using the different variables that have been modeled for us. So once we actually do those things, we have done the scenario analysis, we quantify those different risks and opportunities, and we understand which ones are most plausible for us. We want to develop actions to mitigate the risks and to harness the opportunities, and then set targets and track progress with metrics on an ongoing basis. One thing I did want to say about the operations and value chain mapping, maybe as I was talking, you were thinking to yourself, but I don't really need a carbon footprint in order to do any of this. And that is correct. But we think it makes it a lot easier to do this when you already have done a carbon footprint assessment. Because in the carbon footprint assessment, you'll already have done this mapping of your value chain and your operations. And if you've done, or if you've read about the kind of CSRD double materiality assessment process, the recommendation there is to look at impacts, so climate impacts, your impact on the environment, which is your carbon footprint, and risks and opportunities together, because a lot of times they're very closely linked. So that's why we would also, we understand that companies can, of course, do this assessment without a carbon footprint, but we think it's actually really beneficial and complementary to have it as a starting point and then do the risk and opportunity assessment afterwards. So that's the climate risk and opportunity assessment. And lastly, we want to go into climate transition plan very, very briefly, which is really the culmination of all of the things that we've been talking about so far: the carbon footprint, science-based targets, risk and opportunity assessment, and some more. So a climate transition plan is a strategic roadmap outlining how an organization intends to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and critically align its business model with the climate goals. So under CSRD, companies report on their transition strategies, which are demonstrating how they plan to achieve net zero emissions while ensuring long-term sustainability. But these plans, these transition plans, go beyond just calculating calculating emissions, they go beyond setting ambitious targets. They really require concrete actions and measurable milestones. So a credible plan should outline key decarbonization levers, should maybe we can go through it as I talk through this. So first we'll have the calculating the organization's carbon footprint. We have our footprint with us. We assess climate risks and opportunities, as we've talked about in the previous step. We develop realistic decarbonization measures using the levers that I mentioned before. Define your science-based climate targets, align your strategy with relevant regulations, and integrate this roadmap with the business strategy. So this is where there's kind of a critical difference between just the other kind of analyses that we've been talking about. There's this, in the climate transition plan, there needs to be financial resources that are allocated for implementation, and that needs to be detailed. That needs to be detailed along with the governance structure, the board approval, the governance oversight, who is taking responsibility for this to make sure that there is accountability within the organization, and then communicating this transparently with stakeholders so they know what to expect, and they understand the level of commitment to climate action that the company has. And then, of course, you want to uphold the monitoring and control and continue this process within your transition plan. But essentially, this transition plan is really pulling together all of the other analyses and making it into a roadmap that you can actually action. So it's taking the data, making decisions. Okay, how can I actually decarbonize my business? And then putting financing behind it so we can actually make this transformation happen. And if you know anything about the CSRD reporting requirements, this might seem very familiar to you because a lot of the elements are very much the same. Reporting on the governance, who actually is responsible for these things. I think what the key difference here is probably the integration with strategy to the point where you also need to earmark financial resources in a very clear way in order to communicate that transition plan. That's what makes this kind of the next level beyond just, let's say, a climate strategy. So in the last section, we want to go very quickly through drivers of climate action and its benefits for business before we hopefully have some time for Q&A. So naturally, there are market, regulatory, and societal responses to climate change. We have seen recently that there are regulations that are in flux in the EU. Despite this, we believe they will not disappear. It is a long-term trend that this is here to stay, climate regulation. It will just kind of evolve over time as we get through the politics. But that is not the only thing that is driving companies in order to act on climate. The second thing is consumers. They're looking for more sustainable products and services. Their habits are changing. There is a bigger openness also to different types of business models, product as a service, thinking about resale, repair, reuse. And if you don't adapt to this, then you might have reduced demand for your own products and services, or you might have a reputational risk on your hands. The third area is banks and investors. They are favoring funding for sustainable companies and sustainable projects. So they are more and more including ESG criteria in their investment decisions. And I have a little bit more about this in the next slide. But essentially, you can think about this as producing a potential capital risk if you are not going to align with a net zero transition. You are less desirable from the banks and investors' perspective than another company that is adapting. And lastly, we have business partners. So companies are actually imposing ESG requirements on their business partners. What I mentioned in the beginning when we were talking about footprinting is this supplier engagement aspect, or sorry, supplier procurement, green procurement, we can call it. It's companies that are changing the rules around what they want to procure and asking companies, are you actually committed to decarbonizing yourselves And if so, you kind of get higher points in our procurement process. So this is something that is happening. There's an increasing scrutiny of the value chain, not only in environmental terms, but also social audits are becoming much more popular. And these things will potentially pose a kind of risk in terms of operations for companies, whether that's through contract termination or other types of operational risk. Talking about the investors and banks very quickly, I just wanted to kind of drive home the fact that in Europe, the European Central Bank recognizes that climate change is a risk to financial stability, and it has set supervisory expectations for banks on this topic around managing their risks and also around transition plans. It provided the first guidance already 5 years ago in 2020. So since then, there's been this evolution. Banks have been incorporating these new procedures within their own policies, and it's slowly been trickling down. Banks are assessing their own ESG risk exposure because they have to, also their own financed emissions. But what that means is that they're going to these their own portfolio companies with requests for data. So the demand for ESG data, especially greenhouse gas emissions data, will remain. Even just looking at this one kind of this aspect, which is banks and investors. And also, the implication is that access to and conditions of capital are affected by banks making these changes. So the ECB's bank lending survey of July of last year clearly showed that climate risks were increasingly considered in lending conditions, meaning that more green companies, quote unquote, were given more favorable lending conditions. And so this is again a very real impact, a financial impact to companies based on what's happening. So the last slide that we wanted to talk about is why decarbonization, beyond addressing the climate emergency that we're in, is also able to create business value. So first thing, better financing opportunities. We've just talked about why that is the case, so I will keep going. Lower expenditure on the utilities and maintenance. When you think about what you can identify in terms of energy efficiency improvements from your scope 1 and 2 emissions inventory, you can then take actions that will potentially lower the amount of money that you're actually spending on energy. You can develop stronger relationships with your supply chain and also better manage your risk through the risk and opportunity assessment that we talked about previously. It's been shown that employees that feel like they have an impact on the environmental and social aspects in their companies and the impact that the company has have better retention rates and are attracted to stay at those types of employers. Then enhanced brand reputation and profitability. It's been shown that brand reputation also improves as companies start to pay attention to their ESG topics that are material to them. And lastly, competitive advantage and access to new markets. So this is something that, again, is not a given. It's something that takes a lot of time to figure out for a business, but it is possible to get access to new markets, to innovate, and to make more money through looking at these decarbonization actions. So that's the end of our presentation. I know that we are right at the very end of the hour. And I just wanted to ask if there's any questions from anyone in the audience. I don't see anything in the Q&A chat. You can also just unmute yourself and ask the question live if you prefer. Okay, it seems like there are no questions. If you do think of something that you would like to discuss after this webinar, please feel free to contact us. You'll have our contact information through the emails that we'll be sending you. I just want to mention before we go that we are about to publish next month a study on Polish companies' ESRS climate change disclosures. So please keep an eye out on that. What you'll learn there is things about the reporting landscape, so how Polish businesses are actually adapting to new requirements, the dominance of Scope 3 emissions, and the significant decarbonization challenges that these companies face. And also, what is the pace of energy transition in a country